Hi guys, Dr. J here, and in this video we're going to talk about more regulation related to Part 107 drone operations. And as I say in the subtitle, all the stuff which is really boring until it isn't. That is, until you have a problem or something happens, and then the regulations become really important. So here's a few places where you can look for more information on the topics that we're going to cover in this particular section. In this video, we'll talk about remote pilot certification. If we have time, we'll get to subpart D, which is operations over humans. Probably that'll be in the next video, but we'll see how we go here. So terminology, the remote pilot in command. This is the person who is the final party or person directly responsible for the flight. And so the remote pilot in command, you need to designate someone. Maybe it's yourself. Maybe if you're working as part of a team, you need to designate the person who will be the person responsible for the flight. And this person is the final authority as to the operation of the aircraft. So the RPIC doesn't have to be the pilot. There could be a pilot and someone else who is the person who's responsible. But the RPIC is the one who's going to be responsible for everything that happens and makes the final decisions about what to do in the event of any emergencies or anything like that. The RPIC has a number of requirements. You have to meet certain requirements as the RPIC. Number one, you have to make sure that your drone is not going to pose a hazard to other people, other aircraft, other property. And the way that I think about this is that if the worst happens and your drone falls out of the sky, would it hurt someone or something? And if it would or does, then the remote pilot in command is going to be the one who is responsible for that. The RPIC must have the ability to direct the operations, make sure that the drone is complying with all the regulation. Now, as you may have noticed before, it's actually possible to designate two remote pilot in command for a single mission and for one RPIC to transfer to the other, as long as you can maintain line of sight and there's no loss of control and things like that. This happens where maybe you're flying over a larger area where maybe it wouldn't allow both pilots to sort of see the airplane in the entire flight. You can transfer the flight to another remote pilot in command as long as you can both see the aircraft when you do the transfer, and then the other remote pilot in command can take over and fly the aircraft maybe farther, or maybe you're taking turns controlling the aircraft, whatever it might be. So you can have two RPICs and they can transfer as long as there is continuous line of sight, as long as you can maintain line of sight from both RPICs at the time of the transfer and there's no loss of control. The remote pilot in command may deviate from any of the rules and regulations that we've talked about to the extent necessary to meet an emergency. So if in an emergency situation, the RPIC basically is the one to decide, hey, we're going to do this, even though maybe technically it's against the rules. This is going to be the safest thing to do in this case. The RPIC is the one who's allowed to make that decision. But of course, that means they're also responsible for anything that happens as a result of that decision. And the FAA administrator is allowed to require them to complete a report about what happened and why they did what they did. Note that this is only upon request. It doesn't mean that if you deviate from the rules in an emergency, you have to send a report to the administrator. Just if it happens and the administrator requests it, then you have to. Okay, so that's a lot about the RPIC, the remote pilot in command, a very important position which needs to be specified for every flight that you make. And again, maybe in many cases it'll just be yourself if you're the one flying the drone, but if you're working with several people, then you'll have to designate that. Now, just a few general things about remote or UAS, UAV operations. Obviously, you can't operate in a manner which endangers the life or property of another. This is kind of a catch-all regulation. You're not allowed to drop an object from a drone if it's done in a manner which creates an undue hazard. And again, this is kind of subject to interpretation. But basically, the FAA is kind of expecting you to use common sense, to use good sense about what situations might be hazardous to other people or property. You are actually allowed to operate a UAV from a moving vehicle or a waterborne vehicle, if you are in a sparsely populated area, a rural area, and you are not transporting another person's property for hire or compensation. You're not allowed to fly a UAS from a moving aircraft, and you're generally not allowed to fly from a moving vehicle, but if you're in a rural or remote area, then you are allowed to, a sparsely populated area. And this might be the case where maybe you are flying a drone and you want to move to another location so that you have a better view of the drone. You can do that if you're in this sparsely populated area while the drone is flying. But again, this is a little bit subject to interpretation because, who defines what is sparsely populated? The FAA doesn't have specific numbers of people per cubic or square kilometer or anything like that. So just keep in mind, again, use good sense, use a good judgment about what constitutes a sparsely populated area. Alcohol and drugs. So you cannot operate a UAV while under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And the FAA takes this very seriously. Actually, these regulations are the same or similar for unmanned aircraft. And the legal limit is 0.04 grams per deciliter of alcohol concentration in blood. Or equivalently, you need to be post 8 hours after the consumption of any alcoholic beverage. And obviously not using any drugs. So this is all the FAA's safety regulations regarding alcohol and drugs. And these numbers will show up on the Part 107 exam. So 0.04 is an important number to remember. 8 hours, that's also an important number to remember. No flying within 8 hours after consumption of alcohol. And you need that blood concentration to be less than 0.04 grams per deciliter. Persons that are part of a UAS operation must submit to an alcohol test. Right, so if you're asked to do a blood test, obviously you have to do that. And you're required by the FAA, if they ask you to give them the results of a blood test, you are required to give that to them. And obviously that can be used to prosecute someone in court if that was going to happen. You're also not allowed to carry drugs on the aircraft. So if you are convicted of operating a UAV, small unmanned aircraft, under drug or alcohol influence, well, you can have an application revoked. You can have a suspension or revocation of your remote pilot certificate. And if you have any other pilot credentials, you can also have that revoked. So again, the FAA takes alcohol and drug, operating under the influence of alcohol and drugs, very seriously. Don't do it. Follow the regulations. Otherwise, you'll face these penalties. We also have night operations, another kind of special circumstance. And night is defined as the time between the end of... Okay, so this is I'm going to skip up here to a chart that I have. Here we go. So here's the daytime, sunrise to sunset. Then we have what's known as civil twilight, which is 30 minutes before sunrise and 30 minutes after sunset. After or in between these two civil twilight periods is the night. So night operations and civil twilight operations are actually treated in the same way. But if you see civil twilight, that's referring to that 30-minute span before sunrise and after sunset. And then nighttime is in between there. So from 30 minutes after sunset until 30 minutes before sunrise, that's our night operations. And that's what I just said in those words. So in order to operate at night or during civil twilight, you either need to take the Part 107 knowledge test after April 6, 2021, or take a special training. As you all will now, if you are taking the test from now on, you'll be taking it after April 6, 2021. You won't need to do the special training. You just take the regular Part 107 knowledge test, and night operations are a part of that test. And so the basic regulation is that you have the UAV or UAS equipped with anti-collision lights. And this is really any lights, that is flashing lights, that are visible from at least 3 statute miles. Now, if you are needing to or planning to fly at night, there are several different manufacturers of these types of lights. Some of them are magnetic. Some of them you can attach to your drone with a little mount. But it's pretty easy to find these lights that are visible from 3 statute miles. It actually doesn't have to be, maybe it sounds like a really bright light, but really it doesn't have to be all that bright to be visible from 3 statute miles when it's dark outside. So pretty easy to find these kind of lights and mount them on your drone. The intensity of the light may actually be reduced so that it's visible from less than 3 statute miles if the RPIC, that's the remote pilot in command, determines that it is in the interest of safety. And so again, it all sort of boils down to the RPIC and what they think is the most safe thing to do under the circumstances. Okay, so there's that graph that we looked at, and here is where I'm showing, doesn't matter if it's civil twilight or nighttime, you're going to need those lights, those flashing lights that are visible from at least 3 statute miles away, you're going to need those during those time periods. All right, so let's talk about visual line of sight. When you're operating the unmanned aircraft, you're going to need to be able to maintain visual line of sight. And that means if I am over here operating my drone, this is supposed to be a drawing of me, and not a very good artist, I apologize. But here we are, here's my drone. This is supposed to be propellers on the end of the drone. And there's my camera, I'm taking pictures. So I need to be able to maintain direct visual contact between myself and the drone at all times during my flight. And the only thing that I'm allowed to use to maintain visual line of sight is any prescribed prescription glasses or prescription contacts that I'm wearing. So binoculars are not allowed, telescopes are not allowed. Anything other than your regular prescription lenses that you wear normally, those are not, anything else is not allowed. You must be able to see the drone from where you're flying at all times during the flight. And as we said, in some cases you may move around so that you get a better view of the drone, and that's fine under those specific circumstances, but you have to be able to see the drone. So in other words, if you have, let's say, a little hill, maybe this is a hill and I'm flying, I am not allowed to fly over here. If I put my drone over here, now the hill is in the way, and my drawing is getting worse and worse, I see. But anyway, the hill is in the way now. I'm not able to see it. So I might be able to walk around to the side of the hill where I could see the drone. And as long as I can maintain visual line of sight during the entire flight, that's okay. But if I was to stand over here and then have the drone over here, that's not okay. So this is, let's draw a circle and a big X. Don't do that. That's violating the visual line of sight regulation. And it's not just the remote pilot in command that needs to be able to see the drone. If the person who's actually piloting the drone is different from the RPIC, they also need to be able to see the drone at all times. And if you're using a visual observer, they also need to be able to see the drone at all times, visual line of sight. So you must be able to see the unmanned aircraft throughout the entire flight. And this is required because this is basically a safety thing. The FAA doesn't want you to fly a drone beyond visual line of sight unless you have a special waiver to do that, because you need to know where the aircraft is, if there's any other aircraft around, make sure that you're not endangering the life or property of another. And what we're going to see is that you're actually not allowed to fly over people. So if you can't see the UAV, you're definitely not going to know if you're flying over people or not. So you must maintain this line of sight contact. Now there is a kind of an exception, which is for first person view. So if you've flown drones before, you might be familiar with this idea of first person view. This is where you're going to wear goggles and you'll be able to see just what is in the drone camera. And this is a case where you can't see the drone essentially because you've got these goggles on. And so the FAA kind of makes an exception for this, where you can use a visual observer to watch the drone while you have the first person view goggles on. A little bit of a weird situation because it kind of violates the other regulation, but this is basically what the FAA is allowing at this time. So if you're using FPV, you need to have a visual observer who has visual line of sight contact with the drone at all times. And this is an area that's probably going to change in the future, so you'll want to kind of keep up with this. A few more things about these visual observer people. If you are not so clear on what this is just someone who is helping make sure that everything is safe during a drone flight. So again, this is probably not, this is not you just flying by yourself. This is where you have a team of people and you're making sure, for example, drones are often flown for mapping in cities or in parks. And in those type of cases, it might be very difficult for the drone pilot to be watching not just the drone, but all the people that are around and cars, and making sure that all of that is, you're not flying over people or something like that. And so this is where visual observers come in. They can help the pilot watch the drone and then also watch if there are people around that need to be, kept away from underneath the drone or something like that. And so the visual observer and the RPIC and the person who's piloting the drone have to be able to communicate with each other at all times. And so the FAA doesn't count visual observers if you're not within communication. So if you're too far away to hear by talking and you don't have any walkie-talkie or cell phone or something, then that's not good enough. The remote pilot in command must ensure that the visual observer is able to see the unmanned aircraft. In other words, even the visual observer, even though they're not flying the aircraft, they need to be able to see where it is so they can tell if it's getting above people or something like that. Again, more details. All these regulations have all these details that we go through. The FAA actually prescribes what you should do when you're watching the drone. You need to scan the airspace where the small unmanned aircraft is for any potential collision hazards. So you're watching for other aircraft, and you're maintaining awareness of the position of the drone through your direct line of sight. All right. So that's about visual observers. So if you're thinking about a team flying a drone, you've got the pilot, you've got a visual observer potentially to help make sure that people don't walk under the drone or something like that, maybe multiple visual observers, and then you've got the remote pilot in command, which could be the pilot but may also be someone else. Now there's a few additional regulations just about who can fly the drone and what you can and can't do. You may not fly multiple aircraft at once. Now you might be thinking about these drone shows where you see many hundreds and thousands of drones that are flying all at once, and that's a little bit different situation. You'd have to have a special waiver for that. You're also not allowed to carry hazardous material, and hazardous material is defined in this section of the CFR. It's basically what you would expect, things like gasoline, dangerous explosive substances. And so basically anything which would normally be classified as hazardous material by the Department of Transportation would also classify as a hazardous material here. Drones need to yield the right-of-way to all other aircraft, airborne vehicles, and launch and reentry vehicles. Every other aircraft has the right-of-way instead of you. And you are required to stay well clear, don't interfere with those other aircraft or anything like that. And obviously you are not allowed to create a collision hazard, so you have to make sure that you are way far away from any other aircraft in the vicinity. Okay, so let's take a pause here. We're going to talk about operations over people next, and let's just recap really quickly. So we've got the remote pilot in command, we've got potentially the person who's actually flying the drone, and then potentially one or more visual observers. Those visual observers, the remote pilot in command, and the pilot must all maintain visual line of sight. You must give the right of way to other aircraft. You must not operate under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and you must not carry hazardous materials. So these are the basic regulations for the operator of the aircraft and the remote pilot in command. FAA regulation in the United States is that no person may operate a small unmanned aircraft over a human being. You're not allowed to fly your drone over people unless, this is for Part 107 activities, unless that human being is directly participating in the operation of the small unmanned aircraft. So anyone who's on your team, anyone who is involved in the flight, then they're allowed to be underneath the aircraft. And in fact, some people will actually have someone walk around directly underneath the aircraft to ensure that nobody else is able to do that if there are people that are somewhat close to in the area. Unless, there are a few exceptions, unless the human being is located under a covered structure, i.e. in a building, or inside of a stationary vehicle. Note that the vehicle must be stationary that can provide reasonable protection from a falling fall drone. Moving vehicle is not included in this, you'll notice, and actually operations are also not generally permitted over moving vehicles. There's one other possible caveat, and that is that if you have a drone or an operation which meets the requirement of one of the categories in Subpart D, and we're going to talk about Subpart D a lot more later on, then you can also operate over people, but not unless. So the basic regulation is you can't operate over, and what does that mean, over a human being? The FAA doesn't really specify. So is 5 feet away good enough? Is 20 feet away good enough? How close is too close? And the FAA leaves this up to you, again, as the remote pilot in command or as the pilot. You're required to use good sense. And if there's any way that, and again, the criteria here is that if the drone falls out of the sky, loses power and falls out of the sky, will it hit someone? And if you need to have a larger area to make sure that that drone doesn't hit anyone coming down, then that's what you need to do. The FAA expects you to use good sense when you're thinking about how close a drone should be or how far away a drone should be from people that are not part of the mission. So this is, again, a little bit of an ambiguous area, but if a drone falls and it collides with someone, then that's really going to be a problem with the FAA. And actually requires filing a report, not just with the FAA, but also with the National Transportation Safety Board. So lots more details about that to come as well. Okay, so let's take a couple example questions about this. A farmer is using a drone to inspect livestock while riding in a tractor, and a farm hand drives the tractor through an open field. So the farmer is riding in a tractor. He's not driving the tractor, but he's riding on the tractor. Is this operation legal under Part 107? And the answer is yes, as long as the UAS is operated safely and the farmer is Part 107 certified. So he's inspecting livestock. Number one, he's not flying just for fun, so he needs Part 107. And as long as he's flying safely, they're in an open area, sparsely populated. And that means the farmer is allowed to operate his aircraft from a moving vehicle. And so, yes, this operation is permitted. Who is responsible for verifying that all members of a drone flight crew, pilot, RPIC, VOs, etc., VO means visual observer, have the proper training and are able to maintain situational awareness during a mission? Who is responsible for anything? And you should say RPIC, Remote Pilot in Command, is responsible for everything during a drone flight. And so B, the RPIC. What is the legal blood alcohol concentration for operating a UAS? 0.04, 0.04, 0.08. It's 0.04 grams per deciliter. How many hours must one wait to fly a UAS after consuming any amount of alcohol? Is it 1 hour? Is it until you feel sober? It's actually C, 8 hours. 8 hours after consuming any alcohol before you're allowed to conduct Part 107 operations. A visual observer stands directly underneath the UAS to keep others from doing so. Is this legal? And the answer, yes it is. Because the VO is part of the mission crew, they are allowed to stand underneath the UAS, and in this case, to keep others from doing so.